We're not going to completely take human beings out of the equation, and these analytics and these tools are going to create additional jobs. But the fact of the matter is that we're not going to need, an army of validators in order to figure out whether our tool works or not.
Welcome to a special episode of Law Next. Today's a roundtable on legal analytics that we're recording live from the floor of the Legal Week conference in New York. This is Bob Ambrogi, and we're fortunate to have 4 guests today who are all experts on this topic, but who come at it from some very different perspectives and roles. We'll get to today's interview in just a moment. But first, let's hear from the sponsors who generously support Law Next. And now, on to this week's interview. So what I would like to do is to just begin by asking each of you to identify yourself and tell us what you do. And let me start to my left here. Mark?
Well, thanks, Bob. My name is Mark Smolik, and I serve as the General Counsel for DHL operations in the Americas.
Good morning. My name is Peter Giovannis. I lead data strategy, analytics, and artificial intelligence for the law firm of Winston & Strawn.
Thank you. Carl?
Hey, thanks, Bob. My name's Carl Harris. I'm the CEO of Lex Machina. We're a provider of legal analytics. We help law firms and companies win cases and win business.
Eric Falkenberry, I'm a partner at DLA Piper, and I specialize in litigation risk transfers and also helping the firm use machine learning and natural language processing to develop tools to increase both the efficiency and quality of legal tasks.
So I thought, just to kind of set the stage for our discussion this morning, LexisNexis just released a new study, 2020 legal analytics study, bringing legal analytics into focus is the topic of it. But it has a couple of findings that, Carl, I thought maybe you could kind of summarize for us because they kind of show us where we are in terms of adoption of legal analytics in the profession right now. So can you tell us about that?
Absolutely. So the key result from the survey that I am most interested in is how adoption of legal analytics has accelerated, in particular in the last 2 years. So we surveyed folks and said, hey, does your law firm or company have access to legal analytics? And we asked the same question back in 2017. In 2017, the answer was 38% of respondents had access to legal analytics. And so what we would say then is that, analytics is a growing space. It's really exciting. Everyone's going to have access to it eventually. Whereas the results today are much more favorable, which is that 70% of people have access to legal analytics. So, one thing that I also like to add is Lex Machina is celebrating its 10th year anniversary of providing legal analytics this year. And but really, it's in the last 2 years that adoption has accelerated, and there's primarily 2 drivers of that. So when you ask survey respondents, what are the key things that are driving adoption of legal analytics at your firm or company? The 2 that are at the top of the list are competitive pressures and client expectations at 57% and 56% respectively. And the thing that's really interesting to me about that is those are external pressures. So how do you get a company or a law firm to move quickly and adopt something? Well, there's really 2 ways. You get clients to tell them that it's necessary, or you get them to think that folks down the street are using it, and that's competitive pressure. And that's really, I think, been the key drivers of adoption in the last 2 years. And then finally, forward-looking, there's a really interesting data point, which is that 92% of people who took the survey said they plan to accelerate their use of legal analytics in the future. So it paints kind of a nice story. We're at a tipping point where 2 years ago, some folks had access to analytics. Now most folks have access to it, and more than 9 out of 10 say they plan to accelerate their use of analytics in the future.
So I think what you're saying is it's partly Mark's fault that they're using legal analytics.
Exactly. He's the main driver.
I mean, does that resonate with you? I mean, are you pushing your outside firms to be using analytics, Mark?
I am, but quite frankly, there's still a bit of a deer in the headlights look when it comes to it. It's like, well, what do you mean? I mean, if you dial the clock back 20 years ago, and I won't regale a lot of history, you sent a matter to a law firm, and for those of you who are with law firms, this is no disrespect, this is the role that you had, and it was a very valuable role. A matter came in, a file got opened, a matter got handled, the file got closed, and in the filing cabinet it went. And in some regards, the same is true today, but you can look at the analytics perspective, particularly because we're talking about data from 2 perspectives. It's the data that you have in-house within your own organization and the data that your law firms have. And in many regards, the law firms have more information on me that would help me identify what risks I have and what steps I can take to mitigate those risks than I have. Part of the challenge becomes is that when a matter does go to outside counsel, typically, and by no means am I suggesting counsel represented on this podcast, but the matter would be handled, the matter would be closed, and you'd move on. But folks, I have 132 EEOC claims in the United States every single year. They're handled throughout the country. Wouldn't it be nice if my counsel handling those at the end of a matter would say, you know what, we see this issue and you need to address. And they looked at all that data and they said, here are the trends that we see. Here's a weakness within your own organization. And although it's a bit altruistic, but boy, if you can get your firms to work together and you've got of my 132, they're scattered around 4 different firms. And by no means are those firms going to come together. But if I could take that data and say, what are the trends that you are seeing? And if ultimately you were identifying and say, look, you have a particular site in whatever locale within your organization that is causing the lion's share of these issues, then I've got data that I can leverage to proactively mitigate my risk. And in many regards, not only reduce my exposure, reduce my cost with regard to fees as well, but it is that type of an approach that I am continuously pushing my firms to be much more proactive in mining their own data that they have on my matters to help me better represent the company.
Legal analytics is a very broad term, and there are a lot of different kinds of flavors of legal analytics. Lex Machina is obviously focusing on, I guess, what I would call litigation analytics. Eric, you've built a practice really around using analytics, and you have kind of a unique way that you're using analytics, right? I mean, tell us how you're using them in your practice.
Yeah, I grew up as a traditional litigator and spent almost 20 years doing that, and then started to get into a transactional practice where I was and still am assessing and quantifying the litigation risk of a target in an M&A. What we like to do is I'm often asked to go into that M&A and quantify the litigation risk so that we can negotiate an appropriate price adjustment in order to compensate for that litigation risk. But the really fun part is after we've hopefully closed the merger, we actually go out and we try to offload, sell the risk so that the new entity that has just been acquired is free and clear of those liabilities. And the way in which we do that is there are these private equity firms out there that specialize in just acquiring litigation liability. So they buy companies that really have only 2 things in them, the liabilities and assets such as insurance and cash to cover those liabilities. And their bet is a very simple one, that they can bring efficiencies to the process of resolution so that they can resolve the litigations for less than what the company is worth. And the delta, of course, is their profit. Before litigation analytics, I don't think that there is this market. This market would not have been created without it, because we need the analytics in order to populate the variables in our models. Litigation quantification models have been around for a long time, probably at least 50 years. They go back to Mark Victor at Stanford, who was the first one to put one together, and it's still the same one that's really used today. But all the variables that went into those models were mostly subjective. They were mostly you
didn't have the data.
Yeah, they didn't have the data, and therefore, even if you had 10 litigators hypothesizing on a particular outcome or timing or something like that, that still is a terribly small sample size relative to all of the experiences that we would look at in analytics. So now we have objective means to populate the variables within those models and can do a much better job figuring out the value of litigation.
Yeah. And Peter, you're overseeing analytics in a broad way at your firm. What are some of the ways, or what are some of the key ways that your firm is using analytics?
Yeah, for us, we kind of see the division of analytics helping both the business side of law and the practice side of law. And it's interesting because innovation can come from anything. Earlier in the year, I had a discussion with our director of business development and just asking questions about how that process is done. It lended itself very well to using AI to automate what a human analyst would do. So we can now automate that whole process of, if you will, spotting potential leads to pass on to our partners, but also getting back to Mark's earlier point, now that we collect all that data for every lawsuit that's filed in the United States, we're able then to use a tool or several tools which we call augmented analytics, and it's looking for those outliers or those trends across industries. And hopefully that can change the whole dynamic of a law firm GC relationship, where you could be proactive as a law firm and come to the GC and say, for example, maybe it's the automotive industry, we're seeing this at Ford and General Motors, and if you're the GC of Tesla, we can come to you and give you that heads up. And more importantly, how can we help you get in front of that?
Risk prediction, exposure prediction? I mean,
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I mean, you mentioned, I mean, there's a whole marketing component to all of this, right? I mean, is your firm using analytics in a marketing, business development way?
Well, I think two things come to mind. One is more and more often RFPs are given for opportunities, and they want to know what your analytic capability is. Yeah. And I think that's an area that we shine. Yeah. But I think also more interesting is when you're recruiting these new 1L, 2L, 3Ls to enter your firm as first-year associates, they're asking the technology questions. They're being exposed to these analytic tools in law school, and they're expecting that the law firms will have that technology edge, if you will. And I think there's some stigma about going to a stodgy firm that hasn't embraced these new technologies.
Yeah. And so, Carl, let me come back to you. Just Lex Machina is a very specific product offering litigation analytics. Just sum up what Lex Machina does. What are the tools that you offer to litigators?
Sure. So essentially what we do is we process all the dockets, the briefs, the motions, the filings that happen in litigation, and we use some natural language processing machine learning technology to allow folks to answer questions like, how's a judge likely to behave in a certain scenario? Who's the best lawyer to hire for a particular matter? What's the experience of opposing counsel, or what's the track record of the opposing party in the case? And what should you do strategically to win? And really, at the end of the day, we call that data-driven decision-making to help you win. And so I think that you really get two things when you're making data-driven decisions. Number one is you get a better decision, but number two is you get credibility, which is a point that Eric made yesterday, where if you're making a recommendation to a client about taking a particular path or making a particular strategic decision, you have confidence that you're right, but more importantly, your client has confidence that you're right because you have the data to back it up.
Right. And there's also, and we don't actually have anybody on this panel who can talk about it, but there's also this whole other world of kind of what they're now calling context analytics, which LexisNexis is also doing, but the idea of looking at, say, trends in a judge's decisions to find out what precedent they rely on, what cases they find important when they're deciding summary judgment motions or something like that, so that could inform your writing a brief or making an argument before that judge, I guess, in some way. But yeah. Eric, in your practice, you talked about the importance of the data to what you do. How do you deal with the issue of dirty data, of analyzing how good the data is that's available to you and that you're going to have to work with?
Well, we hire people like data scientists in order to help us do that. Yeah. There's a lot of noise in the data, so to speak, as that's the term that's used, the dirty data, incorrect input data. There's all sorts of reasons that you have dirty data, and it's the data scientist's role in order to be able to spot that. We do modeling exercises in order to see where the noise is and remove it. I went back to school for data analytics, so I have some experience in visualization tools and can use those in order to figure out, how good our data sources are. An additional problem, in addition to, the source, is the methodologies that are used to actually collect that data. Even if the database is good, you have to have the right machine learning, the right natural language processing in order to get the data that you want. And NLP is still, I wouldn't say in its infancy, but it lags way behind what we were able to do or what industries were able to do with numbers. It doesn't take a rocket science to figure out that the computers have a much easier time analyzing numbers than they will text. Now that we have the tools, the NLP, and in fact there's NLP that's coming out that's specifically designed for legal documents, and we're developing our own in-house as well. So we're able to appropriately harness and leverage leverage that information, get rid of the dirty data, and get to the good data that will actually have predictive power to show our clients, what is a likely outcome, what is a cost certainty, and what degree of certainty do we have surrounding that.
Yeah, I wonder about that, because I know, and this is probably something you deal with all the time, which is what people have called the PACER problem, which is what you get out of PACER is full of typos and misspelled names and all sorts of things like that. And was it last summer, some law librarians did a study comparing the different litigation analytics products and found that they deliver dramatically different results for the same queries, the same questions.
Well, part of that, Bob, is because they use different samples. Okay, there were different sample sizes, and it shows you how important a robust sample size is, in addition to having the clean data.
That the vendors are using different samples, or that the testing?
The vendors are using different sample sizes,
right.
And that basically affects your denominator when you're talking about the statistics that you're looking at.
Right.
So it's going to have an impact, but your point is well taken. It's not purely a science; there's an art to it as well. But more information is good, but that's why it's important to really scrutinize what the sources are, what the technology is. And you brought up PACER. I mean, it's not just typos that we're dealing with. There's a lot more that's problematic about PACER. There's very limited coding on PACER. The word motion was not coded in PACER. And also, for the most part, what the data mining entails of PACER is just the headers, just the blurb, not the underlying documents. And those blurbs don't often give you the full picture. When we get access to PACER, hopefully, when it becomes cost efficient to do so, when all of those PDFs that are the underlying documents are OCR'd and are able to be data mined, that's when we'll see some really robust analytics in that space.
Yeah. Mark, what are you looking for? Are you looking for Erics in the outside firms that you're working with? Are you looking for proficiency in using these tools? Are you expecting it, demanding it?
Expecting it, yes. Demanding it, no. Largely because, well, to be quite frankly, I feel like I'm pushing a square peg through a round hole. So it's no secret I'm on the board of a technology company who has surveyed through various large organizations, Federal Express, Procter & Gamble, where their in-house people have surveyed the performance of the law firms. And I won't get into too many of the details, but the lowest scores, whether it's DHL, Procter & Gamble, Federal Express, et cetera, with regard to law firm performance, all have to do with leveraging technology or using data. The highest scores are with regard to the expertise, but there just doesn't seem to be this mainstream approach yet to the value in data. And what I am expecting from my law firms and from external providers, such as you offer, Carl, is in two camps. One, the reactive side of law. The law department 10 years from now is still going to react. We're going to get sued, we got to react, and we got to move. And there's going to be data there that will help us react, particularly with regard to litigation matters. So everything that you're referring to, Eric, is absolutely spot on. But then there's a proactive. And more law departments are going to be moving from reactive to proactive. What I'd like the audience to understand is that standing behind me, helping me make decisions with regard to the management of the law department, is first in line the CFO and then the CEO. These are people that I am accountable to, that when I am presenting to them input with regard to money I'm going to spend, whether it's on your organization, whether it's with your firm, I got to justify it. And in order for me to have $1 to spend with you, the sales department has to generate multiple times of that in revenue to pay it, so there's a high scrutiny. My point being here is the law firm that really embraces what I'll call an innovative way of thinking, not technology, but just an innovative way of thinking of, hey, Mark, we're going to help you and your department, and I continue to hear this from other GCs. Look at all the unstructured data you have in the organization. And it's 80% of the data. It's everywhere. We all know that one email can become 20 emails, 100 emails. But when you have a means of thinking, you know what, we're going to mine that data to help you identify risks that you have, pull that data in, and then act to mitigate them, you're really beginning to move the dial. More and more organizations, first, have no idea where their data is. And even if they do, they have no idea what's in that data. So I'll give you an example, and then I'll turn it back over to you, Bob. Every large organization will send salespeople to conferences like this. They'll come across a competitor. They'll talk about service provider. And the worst case scenario for the lawyer is, hey, here's a price list for your competition. Or they're talking about pricing, or they're talking this, that, or the other thing. But if you had a means of mining your data where you could say, almost like the old Lexis search, show me any document that has to do with pricing or fix or competition or whatever, you pull it in and you say, hey, Eric, with all due respect, next time you go to this conference, I don't want to see this kind of stuff. But that data's there, and you don't realize it until you get sued or there's some kind of investigation. So what I'm going to be pushing hard for with my outside providers, starting first with the law firms, help me leverage the data that you have to react, to lower my cost, lower my exposure. And not with the law firms, but with your organization, Carla, and others, is help me just get a handle on the data that I have so I can identify my risks. Now, I do that because I'm communicating to my CFO and CEO, we need to start doing this, and GCs aren't doing it. It creates in their mind a perception that legal is delivering more value just because they're thinking way outside the box. And that's where the next generation of law departments are really heading, in my opinion.
Does anybody want to respond to what Mark?
I'd be happy. I'd be happy to.
Yeah.
And I would say that in the innovation space, in the departments that run innovation within our law firm, our number one goal is to leverage our own data. I mean, there's no doubt about it. The initial obstacle is really where the data is housed, our DMSs, okay, that were never set up to be data mined. They were set up for version control. And I think new DMS are coming online, but we still have to deal with the historical data that was in the DMS in the first place. There are many different methods in order to get to that data. We've found that the best one is to basically use machine learning and tailored NLP to go get that and create more or less a DMS to be able to collect a certain class of documents, put it in a database, extract metadata from it that becomes the filters, so that our lawyers can not only leverage work product, but also collaborate because we identify who worked on this matter. So, and in the future, I think that, law firm staffing decisions are going to be made using those internal analytics. Lawyer X has won more motions to dismiss in front of Judge X. We're going to put him on your case because that's not only going to be efficient, that's going to get you the best result.
Well, I would think people are already using Lex Machina for staffing decisions or that kind of thing. Is that the case, or?
Absolutely, and it's the point that Eric just made, which is figuring out what either a firm or an individual attorney's track record is in front of a judge with respect to opposing counsel or with respect to an opposing party, but also how those teams work. So one of the things you can do in Lex Machina is you can make a list of attorneys that have worked together as teams, and you can see their track record. How many times has this team worked together? What were the results? What were the outcome in those cases? Because, as I'm sure Mark, as everyone's aware, you don't necessarily hire a firm, you hire a team within that firm, and you want to be able to analyze the performance of that specific team, and that's definitely happening today through Lex Machina.
Take a second to think about the best-run law firms in the country. They consistently handle more cases in less time while spending fewer hours toiling over tasks like billing and client intake. My case was designed to help even the busiest law firms achieve peak efficiency. Through automation of routine administrative duties, templatized workflows, and centralized calendars, my case makes short work of your day-to-day processes and keeps your staff on task. Visit mycase.com to learn more and start a free trial. That's mycase.com. Peter, I mean, you're driving data analytics, AI in your firm. What would have been the challenges for you to get that adopted and used and accepted within your firm?
Yeah, by all means, this role is that of a change agent within the firm. But to the firm's credit, we have set up what we call a technology committee, and their charter or mantra for this year and next year is really how do you get this game-breaking technology in the hands of attorneys to ultimately help their clients and build their practices at the same time. So by having that level of firm oversight and also approval process really has streamlined a lot of our innovation in 2019 and a lot of headway going into 2020.
Yeah. Bob, if I may, Eric, you
Sure,
said
go ahead.
something I want to pick up on because it was insightful for me. At a very high macro level, as the purchaser of legal services, purchasing services, for example, from your firm, my expectation is you've got our data. It's my data. Might be in your files, but it's my data. Mine it. Help me be proactive. Very, very simple. Now, when I come to you with that simple marching order and say, hey, look, you've handled XYZ over the past 10 years. You've got the data. What does it tell me? And then what are we going to do forward to leverage that data? It's insightful for me to learn the challenges that you have in just getting your hands around it and mining it. It never dawned on me to think version control of this document or that document, or even this brief or that brief. So I am asking for a bit of a square peg in a round hole because I want my data, and my expectation is it should be at your fingertips, and you should be able to give it to me, but I didn't appreciate what the challenges are of doing that.
That challenge is a very real one, obviously, and it's not just a challenge that law firms have. In-house legal departments have the same challenge. They have the same type DMS, and we've had clients after we've basically described what we've tried to do with our data and have accomplished with our data. We've actually had consulting engagements where we try to go in and go into a legal department and basically teach the legal department what we did so that you can harness your own data that we don't have.
Well, also, isn't it, I mean, you have not just his data, but you have the cumulative data of however many clients over the years, and you can draw insights cumulatively from that data that could provide value to him, right?
There's no doubt, and that's the goal. I mean, law firms are looking for various new revenue streams in addition to, beefing up their current capabilities. And one of the revenue streams that's being explored by a lot of big law firms is creating tools with that data that can be sold to clients so that you don't have to actually hire us for low-level work that you'd like to do in-house, but you have, the benefit of our knowledge base through these tools.
Mm-hmm. You guys, Carl, you said it, Eric, you said it, and Peter, you said the same thing, and that has to do with all the various data that you had. So we all know across the country in the United States, motion for summary judgments, Rule 56C, right? The federal law is the same. Everybody cites the same rules of law, right? You may handle, pick a number, a dozen matters for me that involve that issue, but you may have hundreds for others as well. My imagine if I get sued, pick a jurisdiction. Plaintiff's attorney is Joe Jones, whoever it may be. This is the particular judge, and you guys have data to come to me and said, based on our experience with this judge, with this issue, and that particular attorney, the likelihood of you granting based on similar facts or getting a favorable ruling on your 56C is X. I now know whether to fight it, whether to put the money at it. 20 years ago, you would just fight it. But data is going to help me. The reason I raise it is not because of how valuable that is for me, but every law firm I've ever talked to resonates exactly with what you're saying, Carl, and that is that law departments hire law firms, not necessarily lawyers. Sure, with bet the company litigation and big transactions. I can't tell you how many GCs I hear say, I hire the lawyer, not the law firm. And then you say, yeah, but not the bet the company litigation overall. If you really want to institutionalize that client, you as a law firm are embracing the whole proactivity with regard to leveraging data. Even if you don't have the ability now, if my law firms came to me and said, this is what we're thinking, we're not there yet, but we're thinking, it would go huge just with regard to the overall value proposition and the perception that I have of them.
Right. I mean, we try to start that conversation right from the pitch stage. I mean, we don't just talk about what our analytic and innovation capabilities are. We present reports. We already know who your judge is in a litigation, and we'll start to tell you what your chances are on a motion to dismiss because that's what you're thinking about in the first instance, right? And then we can explain using that absolute data how we're going to continue to use that data throughout the case to develop strategy. We'll get to summary judgment. We'll figure out the timing of the case. We'll figure out out, when the optimal time to settle and at what value we should settle. We can find out from our own data that, certain cases took, 3 years and still had the same result as a case that took a year. This idea of fighting tooth and nail, just doesn't cut it anymore. And certainly is not consistent with cost containment. It also doesn't make sense with respects to wins and losses. There's no evidence that says that dragging a case on results in a better outcome, and clients realize that, and law firms realize that, and therefore the efficiencies which law firms were very afraid of for a long time because of the billable hour, obviously, now they're embracing it because they're coming up with different models. Different AFAs, things of that nature, so that efficiency is rewarded.
I would think that access to analytics would also help you maybe redefine what constitutes a win and a loss. In the sense that if to win in court, you're talking about a 10-year battle, whereas to resolve it in some other way, it's a 2-year battle or whatever.
No doubt. Most cases settle, right? Or at least most litigations settle. So what is a win? Where is a settlement value a win and a loss? You hear people talking about, plaintiff contingency fees. We're starting to hear talk about defense contingency fees, not contingency, but basically success benefits. Basically, you establish what the case should settle for based on the historical data. If you hit that number, it's your regular fees. If you come below the number, you get a success bonus. And if you do less, you get a discount. The client gets a discounted fee. It's just another way of basically getting rewarded for success. And I've never had a client say to me, gee, I don't care about whether we're successful or not. I just want to contain costs. They want to be successful. They want to win the case, and unfortunately with settlement, it's a little bit hazy, but with analytics, we can define at least historically whether we're doing better or worse.
Right. It's another example where lawyers used to just do it by gut, basically, by instinct, right? And now you can point to some numbers and say...
Right, and there's nothing wrong with gut, but...
Except it's often wrong.
Well, it is often wrong, and the reason it's often wrong is not just because it's subjective. It constitutes a very small sample size. You can have a 40-year practitioner who basically has all the experiences in the world, and his experience or her experiences are 0.0001% of all of the experiences. Analytics, while it may not show you the universe of information, is a much, much larger sample size, and that means it's statistically significant, which is what we're really looking for.
I think if I may add about the data sources, it's a fascinating conversation because we've got kind of collectively at the panel, we have different views, different insights in the data source. So from the company side, from Mark's side, you have all sorts of information on the litigations that you've been involved in, but it also spans multiple law firms. Whereas Eric's internal data source has all of the information for his law firm, but spans multiple companies. For Lex Machina, we go straight to the litigation record. So if you're mining data from PACER, you're mining data from state courts, you actually have access to all the litigation. So those kind of use cases we were talking about, like what is the overall track record on summary judgment for a particular judge or particular law firm, we're going to get that more broadly from the litigation record itself. And the thing that I think is interesting, if you kind of look 4 or 5, maybe even 10 years down the road, is when you can take the broad litigation record that analytics providers like Lex Machina have with some sort of anonymized internal data that you might have or that you might have at your firm or your company, and put those things together. That's kind of the holy grail of the definitive overall big picture data source, and I think that'll be an exciting trend over the next few years.
We'll get back to my interview in just a moment, but first, let's take a break to hear from the sponsors who generously support Law Next. And now, let's continue this week's interview. Peter, you're at Winston & Strong. Eric, you're at DLA. You're at a large corporation. What about access to these tools? And are we in danger of creating an uneven playing field with regard to analytics and litigation analytics in particular? What about the smaller firm lawyer who maybe can't afford it, or even the pro se plaintiff, which is like 90% of litigation in the United States these days has at least one party unrepresented by an attorney? Is that a concern at all?
I think that, so Lex Machina is one of our kind of core values is to bring openness and transparency to the law. And in particular, we would focus on litigation. And I think that, you raise a great point, but the reality is, the way that tools are bought and priced are based on who you're selling to, right? So large law firms charge a larger rate per billable hour. They make more revenue. They pay more money for more sophisticated tools. I think that in terms of pro se plaintiffs, or in particular, you might be talking about moving out of the arena of civil litigation into criminal litigation. I can see a world where those types of tools become, either heavily discounted or even free, or provided through bar associations or things like that. I think there is a way to get access to data to bring openness and transparency to the law with existing tools. It's just a matter of making sure that we're getting to the point where we're covering those types of cases that smaller firms or even individuals handle themselves, which is kind of like the foray into state court and then eventually criminal law.
But do you think that it is actually a concern that those who have access to these tools have an advantage over those who don't?
I do think it's a concern. Yeah. I think that there's different types of concerns. So in the large law space, it's a competitive world. That's just how it is. But in terms of actually pursuing a value of bringing openness and transparency to the legal system, that's not the large law space, right? That's going to be smaller firms. It's going to be pro se practitioners, and I do think it's a concern to make sure that they have the tools that they need to understand how to have their interests represented in court.
They will, but I think it will happen naturally. I mean, you've been around as an organization, Carl, for quite some time, and your firms have been around for quite some time. And here we sit at the largest trade show of its kind in the legal ecosystem in the world, once a year. 20 years from now, a lot of this technology is going to get mainstreamed, and it's going to trickle down. I mean, even 5 years ago, you could not Google residential real estate lease and find a form lease that you could fill in, right? And although it is a very small example, it's one that as more and more this technology catches on, these search tools catch on, these data tags catch on, there will be approaches. And there may be an organization that is a scintilla of your size that is leveraging new available technology to call it the lower masses overall. But I predict it'll happen.
Yeah, I totally agree. One of my professors in school pointed out on the first day that all of the coding that we're learning and all of the data mining that we're learning will be done by machines in about 5 years, okay? And that's going to bring costs down because there's still a lot of manual efforts that are involved. You talk about the noise in the data. That's manual efforts to get rid of that in many cases, validating the data, testing the data. All of that requires human beings at this point. We're not going to completely take human beings out of the equation, and these analytics and these tools are going to create additional jobs. But the fact of the matter is that we're not going to need an army of validators in order to figure out whether our tool works or not.
Yeah. What about the issue of the explainability, the black box issue with regard to some of these tools? I mean, again, that law librarian study, again, showed very, disparate results from different analytics tools. And as you said, there's explanations for that, but sometimes the explanations aren't all that clear. And I would think even in the at the corporate level, explainability of the analytics you use is probably a great concern to some of the regulators you deal with and some of the compliance functions. So to what degree is that a concern, and how do we address that concern?
You look at the legal spend in North America, it's $1.3 billion. I've heard it as high as $1.6 billion a year just on spend with law firms of all kinds. I've heard other numbers that perhaps technology is really mainstream and maybe $300-400 million of that largely through large law. So I think it's still very, very early to tell. But overall, with regard to the maturity level, we've still got a long, long way to go. I mean, Carl, you've got some great services. I haven't used your organization, but even in this environment, as proactive as I'd like to think that my team is, legal operations, and I am as well, an advanced way of thinking, there's a few things that I've learned. Your struggles with regard to just the data. Well, how are we going to get it? My expectations, at your fingertips. Give it to me, show it to me. Let me make informed decisions beginning tomorrow. Peter, it's probably the same with you as well. But then, Carl, you raise a point that I think is just exceptional with regard to in-house counsel. You all have, but it is the Holy Grail. You've got a tool that's broad. You got a tool that's not quite as broad. And I got a tool that's a scintilla of what you guys have. And boy, pulling that all together where you guys are working together to help give me access to data, because I want to pick up on something that you mentioned, Bob, and that is how we define success. Guys, the greatest struggle that I have in complex litigation is not me making the decision. It's the folks sitting around the boardroom, especially the head of a business who gets sued for something that's pounding the table. I didn't do anything wrong. What do you mean we need X number of dollars? And sometimes they're 7 figures. And then you come in and say, we're going to settle it. I didn't do anything wrong. Think of all the revenue I've got to generate to pay that thing off. But my imagine if is if I go in and say, this issue has been decided before this judge, pick a number, 30 different times. And this is the number that it got settled. Well, settlements are hard. You could tell me settlements, you can't. You could tell me judgments. But guys, here's the objective data. Anything below that, success. But then I've got data to rely upon that I'm not sitting there. If Eric, you're my head of a business unit, and you arguing with me, we never should have settled this, and you go away upset because I don't have the data to educate you. Somebody that comes up with that selling mechanism in corporate law departments is going to have a golden ticket to a lot of work. I strayed from your question, but I felt I needed to get that out there. Sorry.
But that's okay.
To your question about the the ability to analyze the data, I think one of the things that everyone should, I'll give the perspective of a provider
not just the data,
of
but the algorithms. And
the data and the algorithms. Well, there's two things. So when you actually use the product itself, whatever the product may be, litigation analytics or something else, you should make sure that the product is willing to show you down to the level of detail where any data point was derived. So we do that at Lex Machina. So any data point that you see in the system, literally any number actually that's on the site, is clickable, and you can drive all the way down if you want to do it to the individual document that was filed in court where that data point was produced. And being willing to show that in a product, I think, is a good signal for how carefully the company takes care of being accurate with data. There are lots of products that show a big number that's rolled up. You ask, hey, how'd that happen? There's no way to dive in deeper. So that's one thing, is going down to where the data point was derived. The second point is you mentioned the algorithms. Natural language processing, machine learning. Eric does a great job of describing this, so I don't want to steal his words, but it's not scary. Somebody should be able to come to you and say, generally speaking, here is how we process data, here's the data source, here are the ways that we calculate results, and this is what you can expect in all the different areas of the product. I mean, I think people are very sometimes afraid of, is deep learning, is it machine learning, what does it mean, are the machines going crazy? It's not, right? For analytics in particular, we're just trying to calculate statistics, trends, predict behavior in the future, and enable you to make data-driven decisions. It's not that scary. You should be able to get under the hood.
Yeah, I mean, you sound like the voice of rationality, but not all vendors are saying that, I don't think. I'm not hearing them all saying that, and some of them are reluctant to kind of get into the black box too much.
But it's really important. I mean, it really is. I mean, when we're trying to, as Peter was talking about, get our lawyers to adopt these technologies, we have to create trust. And ironically, or at least I've found, I mean, certainly you want to, as I said earlier, give them a peek under the hood about the sources and the technology. But one of the things that, I have found to be most effective is really pointing out the limitations of the analytics of the tools, because you're trying to sell basically to analytic-minded people, lawyers. They want to know how the sausage is made, and they want to know where its limits are and where it can be used, on a robust basis. And ironically, when they know about all the limitations, when there is that transparency that they get from the tool, they're more apt to use it, and that's important.
Peter, you have any thoughts on the whole transparency issue? I mean, from where you sit, is that a concern?
I would echo Carl's sentiments. The idea of being able to trace your data all the way through from source to endpoint is really important to us. Also, there's different statistical techniques that we've used, for anything from a neural network, which is more that traditional black box, to using more insightful analytical techniques like decision trees, so you can actually see where the logic is. That's been helpful for us too, is maybe come at it 2 different ways, and the decision tree will show you where the thought process is, and it's much more intelligible for anyone to decipher.
Yeah. Mark, you mentioned that we are really in our kind of infancy in terms of this technology still, and we 20 years from now we're going to be looking back and having much different perspective on this. But let's make some predictions a little bit, just to wrap up this discussion. But where do you see this going, or where do you want to see this going over the next few years, the next 5 years?
Yeah, in the legal space, particularly those that are vying for a piece of the corporate dollar, the law departments recognize that the GC in the future is likely to be more of a business leader than a lawyer. And I say that because of what I am saying with regard to new GCs going into some pretty prominent roles. My CEO told me, I hired you because I think you're probably a better business person than a lawyer. And he's right. I am. That's why I hire guys like you, or surround myself with internals. So recognize that. Recognize there's going to be a different dynamic. There's going to be different expectations. And we all hear about running your law department like a business, and these aren't small spends that we are managing. But it's true, and it's only becoming more and more demanding. It's going to mean that law departments are going to have to continuously improve their value. I don't get evaluated on a win-loss scorecard. I get evaluated on a perception of value. And at the end of the day, hopefully the CEO says, Mark, you're still delivering value, because once you cross that line of you're not, you're out. So it's up to me to partner with guys like you to help me continuously do that and to think very, very differently. Because the law department will be very different. There won't be as much contract review or contract drafting. Much of that is going to be, if AI catches on, perhaps done with the business. So it is going to be a service offering that, particularly with regard to the data that we have, leveraging that data in a way to educate the business about how to identify and mitigate risk. And there's going to be a lot of, at least in my perspective, kind of a view of there's gold in that data, but we just don't know how to get it out yet. And that's what you guys have talked about with regard to access. And that access point, it's a small opening. It just needs to get bigger. And as it does, law departments, I think, will continue to embrace the whole notion of what all you guys are talking about with regard to mining and getting access to that data.
Thank you. Peter, how about you? Where do you see us going with this?
Yeah, perhaps selfishly, I would like to see the role of a chief data and or analytic officer become well entrenched within the AmLaw 100, 200 type firms. As we all spoke about for the last hour today, I think the role of the law firm is changing. It's not just spotting issues, it's providing solutions, and I think data and analytics is a big part of that solutions.
Carl Harris, how about your kind of thoughts about where we're going with this?
So Lex Machina's mission is to bring legal analytics to all areas of the law. And I would say that, kind of my vision for the future is that we do that, and no legal decision, no legal strategic recommendation should be made without data. There is absolutely no reason that in the future anyone should be making any sort of decisions without some sort of data to guide that decision, and that's our view for the future. I mean, there's a bit of a ways to go, but I think that's kind of the clear direction that we want to push the space.
All right. Eric, you get the final word today.
We're sitting here with, 1,000 vendors out there producing, various tools, analytics and otherwise in the innovation space. And we've got some, really brilliant application engineers and data scientists, putting those together. But I think in the last decade, what we saw is, a lot of the vendors trying to create products that were most likely to apply to the broadest range of customers. And I think what we're going to see in the future, and we're already starting to see the data scientists and the domain experts, which in this case are experienced lawyers, working more closely together to produce produce not only tailored solutions, but better solutions. They have to work together. You can't have a data scientist work in isolation and create a good legal product. You need those domain experts, and it's the only question is, are enough experienced lawyers going to take the time to actually, get into long discussions about how they work and the manner in which they produce results, so that the data scientists can understand that and therefore produce the tool that is desired.
Well, Mark, Peter, Carl, and Eric, thanks to all of you for taking time out of Legal Tech. It's a busy time for all of us, I know, and I really appreciate your sitting down and talking about it. Great insights, and thanks for your time.
Thanks
for the opportunity.
This special podcast today was recorded live at Legal Week in New York. I want to give a big shout out to Valerie Chan, the CEO of Platform PR, who was instrumental in helping us line up the guests for the various podcasts that we recorded here during Legal Week. You can find out more about Platform PR at www.plat4orm.com. Also, a big shout out to our Patreon supporter. A reminder to our listeners that you can help support the show by visiting our Patreon page at patreon.com/lawnext. And one of our top level supporters there is John Grant, founder of Agile Attorney Consulting, agileattorney.com. A big thanks to him. And a big thanks to our sponsor who makes this show possible, MyCase. With thousands of customers, is a trusted practice management solution, helping lawyers across the country run organized, efficient, and successful law firms. You can try MyCase for free today at mycase.com. And last but not least, thanks to Ben Ambrogi for producing and editing the show. That's it for this week. This is Bob Ambrogi.